Hi, a good day to all of you. It's a lovely morning here today, and we are going to learn a new lesson. Now, in the previous weeks, we were mainly learning about quantitative research, and we went through multiple different concepts. And the last concept, or the last particular type of research that we were discussing, was about correlations. And not just correlations, we discussed about multiple types of correlations. And from there, we also did a little bit about how to do a manual calculation. And while we were doing that, we were touching upon some other basic descriptive analysis as well. For example, how to come up with sum of squares, how to come up with sum of products, what's the formula for this Pearson correlation, what is Spearman correlation. And if I'm not mistaken, we also discussed a little bit about chi-square test. So we have covered a good number of concepts related to quantitative research. So now, before we discuss more lessons and more concepts on quantitative research, since this is at beginner level, I want to discuss a little bit about qualitative research. Now, qualitative research is something that is very important in my experience in the field of psychology as well. So I decided to take you through qualitative research this week and also in the next week, so that you can have a better understanding about how to do qualitative research. Now, today's session, I'll be giving a basic introduction to qualitative research. Okay, now, these are our lecture slides. Okay, now, here's what we are going to do today. Introduction to qualitative research. Now, what are the learning outcomes? So the first one is to understand what qualitative research is and what are some of its approaches. Just like correlational research in quantitative research, there are a lot of other types of research in quantitative research as well. For example, you can do experimental research, non-experimental, pure descriptive research, and all of that. So we still haven't touched on experimental research. But now that you know the basic process of a quantitative research, because we have done a full correlation analysis, now we know how to come up with a hypothesis and do all of that testing. Since we have that idea, the next thing that we are going to learn is qualitative research. But qualitative research is not just doing interviews and collecting ideas. There are multiple approaches in this, and at the same time, there are multiple reasons that which motivates us to go ahead and consider a specific approach or a specific analysis type. And one could think, okay, if it is interviews, how could you have different types of analysis? Yes, you can have different types of analysis. And then I am going to discuss a few of those today and how exactly you need to build yourself to approach qualitative research. So understanding some of the basics is one thing that we are going to do today. And also, I'll be discussing slightly deeper about phenomenology and interpretivism. Now, don't worry about the concepts right now, because we are going to discuss it very soon. So once we discuss that, it will make more sense. Now, why do I talk about qualitative research, and why do I have this much of enthusiasm when I talk about qualitative research? See, here's the thing. Now, when I started my very first degree, which was in psychology, and then I was asked to study gerontology as my minor. And I had no idea what gerontology was at that time. So when those days, I took a class called Sociology of Families. And then I was told that gerontology is the study of aging populations and things like that, pretty much aging, if I remember it correctly. And then I decided to go ahead and study sociology instead. So psychology was my major and sociology was my minor. And while I was doing sociology, I understood how much one could learn from the society around us. And one of my favorite areas of study in sociology was social problems, which I was not good at. And then there was something that really intrigued me, that was race relations. So understanding minority groups was one of my key areas of interest, which is something that I continue to do in my second MSc and also in my PhD. So really good stuff. But there is one thing that I really loved doing all of these things about minority groups and all of that, that is qualitative research. When I first started my academia, after completing my first psychology degree and my first MSc, I was 100% into quantitative research. So when I went for my second MSc, my supervisor told, look, you know quantitative research, you don't want to do it again, you do qualitative this time. I had a hard time getting myself out of this independent variable, dependent variable kind of thinking, because for me, everything is uh, pretty much demonstratable in the form of relationships. So relationships have variables, then I know how to test it, how to report it, and boom, that's my research. So it took me some time to realize that no, I can go ahead and explore more depth in things. So my biggest learning was through qualitative research that there is so much of depth in things, and then I have to spend some good time to uncover this information. So that was something that I really learned by doing this qualitative research. And I hope that I would be able to do the same for you today in this lecture, so that you will have some appreciation towards qualitative research. So before we start, what do you think this image is? What do you think is right here on your screen? And you know it's a fruit. You can see its color, it's red. It has a particular shape, and it has this little thing on the top with a small leaf. And you know this is an apple. But how do you know it's an apple, the fruit? How do you know it? What was the ideas that went through your mind for you to come to this understanding that this is an apple? Because if this is an apple, then what is this? Well, for me, that also looks like an apple. It's just that, previously it was a different color. Now this is green. And if you look at the particular leaf right here, it seems like there is a smoother edge in this particular leaf, but in the next one, it is not so smooth. I think it is an apple. I don't know whether it's 100% an apple, but I think it's an apple. Last time I did with some of my students, they told me this is an apple. But how do I know this is an apple? This is my subjective experience I'm talking about. In quantitative research, we want to do things objectively. That's why we give questionnaires. These questionnaires are very reliable. We get data, we analyze them. But qualitative research is not like that. I want to know your experience. How do you know that this is an apple? So if this is an apple, what is this then? Well, that is pears. But if you notice, the leaf looks more or less similar. But if you look at the color is slightly different, and you see a little bit of dots here and there. And at the same time, this is slightly more elongated compared to the previous round shape or the spherical shape apples that we uh, just looked at. And this also has a little thing, the way on the top, but we know this is not an apple. This is a different type of fruit. But now the thing is, I want to know what went through your mind for you to come up with this idea that this is an apple or this is a pears. Now, in our second week, we discussed about the scientific method. Now remember, scientific method is just one of the methods of finding true information. You can find if something is true or not by taking things through the scientific method. For example, if I want to know whether a ball, a plastic ball, or maybe let's say a tennis ball and a rubber ball. So I have two balls, one is tennis and one is rubber. I want to see which one of these things would come down fast, or which one of these touch the ground first, or would they fall to the ground at the same speed. This is something that I would want to go ahead and have some understanding. So I want to seek true information about the speed that objects fall from the sky. Now, if that's the case, I can do it through my scientific method, and I can see what exactly is the speed, how much time it took to come down. I can show it again and again. If someone says my answer is wrong, I can give the method so that they can replicate it further. And if I'm wrong, they can disprove me as well, saying, look, what you have done is wrong, so we are going to refute. We can't accept what you have done. That's the scientific method. But that is just one way of finding this information. Now, they are, for me to understand the speed at which the ball would come down, or the two balls would come down, I am keeping myself away from it. I just try to understand it very objectively. But regardless of how much I want to understand things objectively, sometimes one could think, well, if you need to understand true information, you need to understand subjective experiences as well. Although the ball keeps on coming at a particular speed, I am experiencing the fact that these two balls come down. So if I am seeing it through my senses, then I am having a subjective experience which is worthwhile investigating as well. Okay, now the balls come at a particular speed, but why would I see it at them occurring at the same speed? Would my experience be different from his or hers? Or do you think we'll have different experiences from one another? Or do you think some of us go through one experience and another group would go through a different experience? How do I reconcile with this fact? So for this, we need to discuss a little bit of philosophy. Now, this is actually philosophy. So here I have mentioned, remember, on the very first day of our class, I told the research is a systematic inquiry. You use a particular system to understand research. But however, the exact system is determined by a set of complementing and at times competing set of philosophies. How you go ahead and do a research is determined by some of your assumptions, some of the philosophies that we subscribe to. So now, previously, when I taught quantitative research, I was taking you through a specific philosophy. Scientific method comes in a specific philosophy. We'll discuss that later as well. That's a specific philosophy. But that is not the only philosophy that is available to understand what is happening around us. And I have been grappling with this thought for a long time when I was doing research, when I was learning research, and also when I started to teach research. Because I started teaching at a very young age, and I always had this confusion, why exactly we have this much of branches? Which one is the right method? Which one is the erroneous method? And so on and so on. But I had more appreciation for all of this when I started to do qualitative research. Now, here you see a tree. Here you have multiple branches of philosophy. So philosophy is this umbrella like a thing which gets you to know more about knowledge. And my interpretation of this might vary from a person who has done philosophy as the field of their study. I'm a psychologist, and my understanding on philosophy is very limited. But if you know someone who has studied philosophy for their degrees, for example, Bachelor of Philosophy, Master of Philosophy, and stuff like that, you probably might have a better understanding about all of this. But just my understanding here, metaphysics, that is, we call it ontology as well. We'll be discussing that. And then we have cosmology, theology, aesthetics, ethics, epistemology, logic, realism, idealism, etc. These are all different philosophies. Some of these things are pretty much overarching, which means some of these are pretty important to understand the rest of the things. But these are all different ways of thinking and understanding the world around us, if I very simply put it. Okay. So let's try to first start our discussion with general metaphysics or ontology. Now, in ontology, we try to study reality. Not we try to study reality, we actually study reality. Ontology is about studying reality. So what is real and what is not real? How do I know the previous apple that I showed you is real or not? So Immanuel Kant, in his transcendental idealism, said reality is spatial and temporal dependent. Now, see here, what is meant by spatial and temporal dependent? Now, this is a calculator. They call it a scientific calculator. See, I can see this. Why? Because you see dimensions, right? It has length, breadth, and also a little bit of height. So this is a 3D object. Spatial, I can see the space around me. I can see this. And at the same time, just like it is spatial dependent, this is temporal dependent as well. This was produced some time back. Let me see whether I can see this. It says it's, yeah, I don't know when it was exactly made, but I have been having this at least for the last 10 years here. So this was produced some time back. And then this exists through space and time. It continues to stay, right? So everything that is real, that is physically present in front of me, they are spatially and temporally dependent. So if I need to know whether something is real or not, then I probably should be able to see it, right? If I see it, what it means it of course is temporally dependent as well because it exists through time. And Hegel, in his absolute idealism, that is also another philosophy, he says what is around you is a product of your mind. Now let's get to this point again. Now this is my calculator. How do I see this color? What is this color? Well, it looks like black or dark blue. I don't know. I think it looks black. It looks very black to me. Correct me if I'm wrong. And how do I know this is black? Do you think color exists in the real world? Now we know we have, we can see three main colors. If you get the structure of the eye, you have rods and cones, and then these things can see three different types of colors. So when the light waves hit your eye, it stimulates these colors or photoreceptors, and depending on the frequencies of how or the degree to which it gets stimulated, your brain receives a message, and then things will be interpreted in your occipital lobe, and then you see or perceive color. Your eyes get this information, but your brain does the interpretation. So then it begs the question, is color something that is really existing in the world? What if I don't have three different types of photoreceptors? If I just have two, or what if I have more than those things? What if I can see more than three? Now we can, as humans, we can see three main colors and everything else is a combination, right? So what if I can perceive more than three? Obviously, there could be certain other animals who would see far more breadth of colors, right? So then if if the interpretations in my brain gives the rise to these colors, so then what is happening inside my mind should be very real as well, right? So one is saying if something is existing outside, then it should be real. But then again, if I sense something, if I perceive something inside my mind, then that also needs to be real. So these are all very summarized ways of understanding Kantian philosophy and what Hegel has said. There are specific videos on YouTube you can check to understand more about all of these philosophies. These are massive philosophies, so I'm not going to get into all of those. Now, very similar to Kant and Hegel, Edmund Husserl, in his Transcendental Phenomenology, he said, well, what is true, or the experience, it changes from one person to another, but certain physical laws, for example, the speed at which a ball falls down, there is a specific law that says, or that describes the speed things fall down. So those kind of objective truths exist in the real world, although my experience is different from yours. So we have different experiences, but real stuff, objective laws still do exist outside our cranium. This is cranium, so outside our cranium, we would see those things as well. So then, now that's a different way of understanding what is true and what is not true. And then it doesn't stop from there. What Husserl started was later developed or later transformed further into existentialism, where they say we are always in the process of becoming. I want to become a doctor. I want to become a particular person. I want to do these studies so that I could become someone. So we always are in a process of becoming, and thus we should understand what goes inside our minds, because there is no way that we can understand reality without our own perceptions. I can't understand anything in this world without my mind. It is always there. It's very difficult to strip this component out and say, look, I'm going to understand everything objectively, but I don't need this for this particular task. It's impossible to think like that. So these are all different philosophies. And then we have positivists who say that what is real can be reasoned, which means it has to be rational, and verified through sensory experiences. Okay, now we are talking. So what is happening inside my mind is real. What is staying outside can be real. So we can reason what is real and what is not real through logically derived, arguments. We can do that. But if what you reason is correct, then we should be able to experience it from our senses. We have 5 senses. So if you are saying something is real, then I should be able to experience it. If you say you can fly, I should be able to at least see it. If I can't see it, there is no way that I am going to accept it. So that's the thing. So these are at times very competing philosophies, and these are sometimes complementing philosophies. But each one of the things that I mentioned, they are pretty much, different philosophies, and then they have distinct research methods for each one of those philosophies. I do actually have a book on phenomenology written by uh, John John Naismith and Flowers and Larkin, which is about how to do research using this phenomenological method. So a very interesting book. I would encourage all of you to read this book to understand more about how to do phenomenological research. But we'll discuss it today. So before we go ahead and discuss that, let's try to understand 2 more concepts, a priori and a posteriori. A priori means purely reason-based things, and sensory experience is absent. For example, certain things can exist. I can reason about the existence of those things, but I still haven't experienced such existence through my sensory organs. For example, I can reason about the existence of the unconscious mind, but it's very difficult for me to get someone else to experience my unconscious experiences through his sensory organs. For example, now let's say you have 5 senses, right? And if I say that, I have some unconscious experiences and I have something called the unconscious mind, and if I want you guys to get convinced of this, I can reason about this, but there is no way that I'm going to show it to you so that your senses can actually grasp it. Now, there is no sensory experience there. I am saying it, of course, you can hear, but what I hear is not the unconscious. What I say is not the unconscious. It's a reflection of what I say about my unconscious mind. I'm saying I have something called the unconscious mind, but you can't really see it, you can't hear it, you can't taste it, you can't touch it, nothing. So then you are getting convinced because of the reasoning that I do. It's like saying that I have a language acquisition device inside my mind, which is why I speak effortlessly when I'm 3 years old without too much of instruction on language. So then how can I prove it to others? It's very difficult because there is no sensory experience associated with proving such a fact, because I can't show it. Can you show at what point the child, who is 2 years, let's say he speaks a little and suddenly he speaks when he's 3, can you show it at what particular time he exactly start to speak? You can reason about it, but very difficult to show. At least right now, we don't have that capacity to show what exactly is going through. So that's what I'm saying. So we are reasoning, but we lack the sensory experience to support it. A posteriori is different. Here, your reasoning is then proceeded with sensory experiences. So for example, I am saying balls, if it is dropped at a particular height, will come down at the same speed. If my reasoning is correct, it's just a matter of, getting two balls and putting it down so that when it hits, I know the time is exactly the same. So that is now, if I do that, then you have sensory experience. You can see that I'm doing it. And at the same time, you can experience the entire thing. So when we do empirical research, for example, let's say I am proposing that self-efficacy has an influence on mental well-being. So show it. Show it that if someone is efficacious, they have better well-being. Show it that if someone has low efficacy, they have poor well-being. If you can show it through a research, then yes, we have some sensory experience of it. Now, this is how a priori and a posteriori would work. Now, with all of this, I'm going to take you through ontological assumptions. For a researcher, his understanding about the world and the nature of reality is very important. So understanding the nature of reality is what we call ontology. Okay, so ontology gets divided into multiple components, and there are a lot of other philosophies as well underneath this, but I am going to just focus on a few that I know. Realism, positivism, relativism, critical realism, phenomenology, idealism, and existentialism. So, idealism says that reality exists in the ideas of the mind, not necessarily in the material objects. So, objects could exist, but if my mind perceives it, then this should be real. And then we have realism and positivism. So pretty much we use these in our scientific method. But realism and positivism is also not the same thing. There are subtle differences of those two as well, which I'm not going to get into in this lecture. And then we have relativism. So one thing about realism is, in realism, you believe that everything has a single explanation because reality should be the same for everyone if it is true. But in relativism, they say, no, reality differs from one person to another. In critical realism, they say reality differs from one person to another, but still there are objective things outside. And then there is idealism, we discussed that, and there is then this next thing, phenomenology. Now, the original creator of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, he considered phenomenology to be a bigger philosophy. It's not something that comes under ontology, according to Edmund Husserl, at least the stuff that I read about his work. This is much bigger than that. But to make this much more convenient for us to understand, I'm going to just include it under ontology. So phenomenology believes in experiences of people. We have to understand the experiences of people, and through that, we can understand more about how people make sense of things to discover true information. And existentialism is an extension of phenomenology. So we'll discuss that as well. Okay. So this is why qualitative research is really interesting, because you are grappling with so much of philosophy to justify your method of inquiry, how you go and find this information, and what's the purpose behind all of these things. Now, you need to pick up a specific philosophy. Now, ontological assumptions mean you selecting what particular philosophy that you are going to follow. So if you are a scientist, you would probably believe that, okay, the reality has to be one single explanation. There can't be multiple explanations for these things. But if you're a qualitative researcher, you can go with relativism and say, look, no, it's not like that. Reality differs from one person to another. So that's my assumption to start this research. Now, these days, I do a research where I study minority experiences. Now, minority experiences are stuff that you can't directly study, saying that, there is one big explanation for systematic racism in institutes, or, marginalization of minority groups. There is one particular explanation for that. These are very difficult things to say. So I believe by understanding human experiences, by acknowledging that truth experiences differ from one person to another, I can go ahead and study this particular concept or the component of racism, minority groups, discrimination, and stuff like that deeper. That's why I selected a phenomenological approach. So here, once again, they believe that truth differs from one person to another. But objective laws could exist. I'm not denying it. Those things could exist, but we know our experiences and what is true might change from you and I. It's a subjective endeavor end of the day. So in some sense, this is somewhat similar to critical realism as well, but it's a separate thing, phenomenology. Okay, so this is my ontological view. I believe reality changes from one person to another. That's just my assumption about reality. So when I have that assumption about reality, my next thing is, okay, how do I need to get this information? Now, for that, we need to have epistemological assumptions. Epistemology, also known as theory of knowledge. Now, there are a lot of methods for this. Now, here I have mentioned logical positivism. Genuine knowledge is objective and quantifiable. If you want to get true information, those information has to be objective. Whatever it is, if it is subjective, then you should be able to quantify them. Quantify means just like, can you remember how we did that example on correlations? Very similar to that. You can go through the correlation lesson once again as well for if you don't remember it right now. We have a specific method to quantify the relationship between alcohol intake and satisfaction, or alcohol intake and money saved. So I am saying, well, if you drink so much, you probably are not going to save a lot of money. Then one could ask, do you think that is an objective truth? I am saying, yes, it's objective truth. So if it is an objective truth, I should be able to quantify it. So I have demonstrated how I quantify it and how I demonstrate this relationship statistically through by conducting a correlation. That is why I did that correlation analysis, to show it. Now, one could argue how valid is my method and all of that. To increase its validity and all of that, there are a lot of other experimental methods that you can do. And also there are a lot of other analytic strategies that you can follow as well. That is not what we are going to discuss today. I just wanted to show you guys, if I'm saying there is a relationship like this, that correlation analysis that we did is an example to show that, okay, this is how I quantify something. But then again, one could say, okay, Naren, you quantified this, that is correct. But don't you think that my subjective feelings play a key role here? Well, I might be a person who is consuming alcohol, but still I could also be pretty knowledgeable about finances and a lot of other things. And I have a family as well. So I might consider saving a little bit more money, although I consume alcohol. Maybe if I stop consuming alcohol, I might be able to save more, but still I am consuming while saving. So then that behavior is not 100% aligning with the theory that I am proposing. Because if someone is consuming so much of alcohol, there is no way that he's going to save more money or anything like that as well. But then again, I can think about, okay, what kind of things then motivate people to consume alcohol? Is it just always, being addicted? Is it because, these people go through different experiences? Or is it because, what I am going through, even though I understand it, is his experience very different from what I am going through? Or do you think, he's been pressured by his friends? Do you think, the country's situation is affecting him? So what's happening? Why exactly he started to drink? So if you go through our previous example in correlations, we had about 10 people. So 10 people is good enough to do a qualitative research as well. You can go and interview them. And you can use interpretivism to understand their experiences related to the use of alcohol. So, for example, interpretivism here says knowledge gained through understanding the meaning of the process or the experience. So, understanding the meaning behind the process or the experience. Now, if someone is consuming alcohol, I need to know why exactly he is doing this. how he makes sense of alcohol usage, how he makes sense of himself carrying out daily work while consuming all of this. Is it difficult? Is it easy? Is it a problem? What exactly is happening inside his mind? I don't know. So this is a very subjective endeavor. So I can interview this person and I can really understand what goes inside his mind. So interpretivism helps us to understand the thinking patterns of people and all of that. So this is very important for us to understand qualitative research. So I believe in my ontological assumptions that reality differs from one person to another. So if it differs from one person to another, I have to figure out a subjective method to extract this information. So for that, I may use interpretivism. Now, if you are interested in reading more, I have given a hyperlink here so that you can read. And if you think reality is singular and it is present independent of your mind, you should assume genuine knowledge is objective and quantifiable. Thus, you could go for the scientific method. If you are a scientist, you know, regardless of what I think, what is true exists. If I live or die, the ball continues to drop at the same speed. Do you think the ball will drop at a separate speed if I die? No, right? If I live? No, right? So my present doesn't matter for the ball to come down. It always comes down at the same speed that it does. So what is real is then independent of my mind. So that's the scientist way of thinking. And then he will, and that's one explanation for it. And he will go ahead and go through the scientific method, and his epistemological assumptions would say that, you know, I have to study things in an objective way. But if I'm a phenomenologist, or if I'm someone who is studying the society, stuff like racism and all of that, these are all subjective experiences in the first place. It's very difficult to show racism in a very objective sense because your subjective experiences play a key role in terms of understanding how I get discriminated in the society. So then in that sense, the experiences changes from one to another. What is real and what is not real in racism, pertaining to racism, changes from one person to another. And then I have to study that utilizing a subjective method so that I can use interpretivism. That's why I have mentioned here, if you think reality is relative, and even if reality is present independent of our mind, our experiences play a key role in making sense of our surroundings. Then you should assume interpretivism or constructivism. Now, okay, another argument is, what is interpretivism? What is constructivism? I'm not going to get into all those things right now. Some say it is the same, some say it is the two different sides of the same coin. So I would think it's the two sides of the same coin. These are all methods that you could use in qualitative inquiry. So your ontological assumptions guide are important for your epistemological assumptions. So when you have your ontological assumptions and epistemological assumptions aligned, then you can go ahead and come up with your method. Now, there are multiple methods: interpretative phenomenological analysis, grounded theory, ethnography, narrative analysis, discourse analysis. So these different types of methods. So depending on what you like, depending on the philosophy that you subscribe to, you can go ahead and do your research. But before we go and go through and discuss those, let me give you a better introduction to qualitative research. So it's going to be a bit of a long lecture. So qualitative research attempts to broaden or deepen our understanding of how things come to be the way they are in the social world. Now, I am interested in understanding the society, but how exactly do these things present in a specific way around me? How do I make sense of all of this? Now, I study about minority groups and race relations and all of that. How do I make sense of systemic racism that is happening inside our country? Now, you know, Sri Lanka is a country with a history of a civil war, and people had a tough time in this country. Why? Because we had difficulty understanding each other. And Do you have any guarantee that we understand each other very well right now? This is not to blame the government or anybody else. This is just trying to understand as human beings what we go through. How do I make sense of this? How am I going to reconcile with the fact that we still don't have good understanding with each other, the ethnic groups? How am I going to make sense of then these perceived differences between different groups of people? So this is why we need to do qualitative research, to understand the depth of the issue. And these are things that are rooted in anthropology and sociology. Most of the qualitative research work that we do, they are most rooted in anthropology and sociology. So qualitative research is ideal to understand real life context. You are not going to prove anything. You don't need to prove anything by doing a qualitative research. You are trying to exploit. And now, if you might have noticed, now when we discuss about scientific method and then correlations and all of that, we use words like association, effects, investigate, and stuff like that. But now I always keep on saying about exploring, because my idea or my objective is to go ahead and explore things. So qualitative research is all about exploration, and you go deeper in the exploration or your journey of exploration. And this is ideal for sensitive topics. Now, I told that I study about minority groups, and it's a very sensitive topic. In a country like Sri Lanka, you can't do these kind of studies without offending a group of people. So you have to be very, very, very mindful about what you do. You can't offend anybody, but at the same time, you have to get to the bottom of the issue. You have to understand the cause, like why exactly these problems keep on happening. Why do we see these things happening again and again and again in our society? In 90s, as a kid, I have seen ethnic groups fighting. More than the ethnic groups, politicians and other authorities. In 2000s, while I was in school, I have seen the same thing. After 2010, while I was going to university, I have been seeing the same thing. Now this is 2023. Other countries have electric cars, light rail transits, and whatnot, chat GPTs and stuff like that. But here we are busy fighting who has, more claim for the land, who is the biggest race, who has the capacity to, run this country, because we have the best religion and stuff like that. Why? Why do we have these things? Doesn't that reflect a much deeper problem in the country? Racism or the discrimination or marginalization of groups is something that is at surface level, but it's a reflection of something much deeper. The problem is much deeper in our country. So if I do a qualitative research, by doing my qualitative research, I attempt to understand these deep issues, the latent issues that I directly can't reach. This is just a manifestation. People fighting, lack of understanding, they are all manifestations of a much deeper issue. And it's very difficult to go and understand these kind of issues. It takes a lot of time and effort. So to do this, I need to know about individual experiences of people. For example, I can go and talk to a person, let's say in the District of Colombo. I go and tell him, well, can I interview you? I ask him. And then if he says yes, or if she says yes, I get her to narrate her experiences about being marginalized. Now, marginalization is not common only to minority groups. In Sri Lanka, it is common for many other groups of people as well. You can be a person who is representing the majority group, but still you can be politically marginalized. You can be economically marginalized. You never know. But I need to know how exactly this happens. Because if you represent a particular economic stratum in the society, then you can probably be called a minority group as well. If you are disabled, you are a minority group once again. In our country, the access that you have for a lot of things is very limited. You go to a bus, you are disabled, good luck getting inside. You go to a government office, it's very difficult to get in. It's not accessible. So then, am I being included in the society? Do I feel that I'm a productive member in the society? What has happened to inclusiveness? So then, am I being marginalized? Yes. So if I talk to that person and get that person's experience, I get to understand more about that core issues that we were talking about earlier. So it's not just racism then. Marginalization, discrimination, and all of these things have much more common issues. So likewise, by doing multiple interviews, I can understand the core of the problem. So this is very good. Qualitative research is very good to understand in-depth phenomena. Now, why do I say this? Now look at this image right here on the right corner. Now, this is Colin Powell, 65th United States Secretary of the State under President George W. Bush. Now, this was the exercise we received while I was doing my undergraduate studies in uh, year 2012. We had the class called Race Relations and Minority Groups. In that class, our professor showed an image of a group of people and told us to say to what ethnicity they belong to. Now, being a person who has studied abroad for a long time, there were many instances that I got confused with people. For example, sometimes I see someone who looks very Sri Lankan, dressed like Sri Lankan and all of that, and I try to go and talk. Sometimes the person is from Bangladesh. And in some occasions, the person looks very Sri Lankan, but he is from Brazil. We have the same skin color, combed hair just like us, and he might pretty much stay just like myself as well. But then again, he belongs to a Latin country, I belong to an Asian country. So are we having the same ethnicity group? No, we can't just decide who is who just by looking at people. So Colin Powell is a good example as well. I did the same exercise and I asked, what do you think about the ethnic group of this person? And most of them told, I think he's white. But no, he is not white. You can search, and then I don't want to categorize people. Look, okay, that's not my intention here, but I just want to show that we can't decide a person just by looking at their face. So then I can ask, how does it feel to be African American in the United States? What does it feel? Now, let me give more context to this problem, okay? Now, I am half Tamil, so which means half of myself is Sinhalese. But unfortunately, I have a very Tamil sounding name. So during the time of war, it was very difficult because in checkpoints, I kind of sense that I have been searched more because you can't blame anybody as well because uh, you never know. But I grew up, my entire childhood I spent in Goa. I don't speak good Tamil. And at the same time, I lived just like anybody else who lived in Galle as well. All my friends are Sinhalese, and then I have been, and my grandparents are Sinhalese as well. And I grew up with temples and all of that, just like any other conservative Buddhists in the country. But then again, doesn't matter how much Sinhala I speak, how much of Buddhism I know, the moment the security forces see my identity card, then I know I have been searched a little bit more than the rest of the Indian. I don't say I have been discriminated like that, but I just sensed because it's confusing sometimes to the security forces as well. How come he speaks good Sinhala and do all the stuff like normal other person? And why would he have a different name? Doesn't make sense. But on the other hand, my sister has a very Sinhala name. And most of the problems that I went through, she has never gone through. I had a friend in my school as well, and his surname is pretty much it's kind of it's not a common, it's not a Sinhala name, but then it doesn't sound like a Tamil name as well. So it's a very neutral name. And then he has a Sinhalese first name. His given name is Sinhala as well. So he had no problem as well. So him and I, we have the same backgrounds, but I have more experiences with checkpoints and security forces and stuff like that compared to him, simply because, I have a very Tamil sounding name. Now, one might argue, what BS is he talking, there is no such problem like that. Now, that is exactly my point. From your perspective, it is very difficult to understand what I have gone through. And the only way that you are going to make sense is by listening to my experience and trying to make sense of my experience. Very similar to me, there are many others who have gone through the experience as well. But it all depends from one context to another. Now, what Colin Powell may have gone through is very different from a general African American person. So then, how does it feel to be African American in the US? How does it feel to be Tamil in Sri Lanka? So a Tamil person's experience in the North is extremely different from the experience of a person in the South. There's a noticeable difference. And the experience of a estate worker who is also Tamil is even further different from the person in the North and the South, because that's a very marginalized society. You can read plenty of research about that, about how marginalized the estate community is in this country. So for you to understand these phenomena, you have to go deep into these issues. And then you can actually understand more about like what is happening, how these things can be made sense of and whatnot. So now let's do a small exercise. Now, since we have discussed about what you call qualitative research, let's try to see which questions are qualitative research, which particular questions might be a best fit for qualitative research, and which research questions might not be good fits for qualitative research. Now, for example, a comparison of the effectiveness of drug A versus drug B in the treatment of migraine. Now, a comparison, effectiveness, drug A and drug B. Now, this sounds to me pretty much like a quantitative research. You can quantify and do this. Look at the words, okay? Effectiveness. Look at this now. An exploration of the role of practice manager in the primary healthcare team, a study of 4 practices. An exploration sounds like a qualitative research to me. An examination of young people's and parents' account of communication about cancer in childhood. So examination of cancer, it's a very sensitive topic. I think it would be better to do this in a qualitative way. A national survey of the public knowledge of the nature and extent of abuse of older people. So it's a national survey. So then, of course, it has to be conducted using a quantitative method. And yes, so that would be a good fit, a quantitative research. Now, I already told about what I do in my research as well. So there's a glimpse of what I do these days in my research work. So I research about minority students, I told, and their leadership experiences in the state universities. So now here I try to understand leadership of minority students in multiple methods. I try to understand their socio-cultural experiences and also socio-political experiences. Now, culture has a key role in shaping someone's leadership skills, and politics does the same thing. It shapes the way how a person perceives or carries himself pertaining to leadership and also the society. So I explore how these things may have some influence on minority groups. So for instance, civil war. How has the civil war influenced minority students and their leadership? Language policies of the country, existing discrimination, marginalization, and post-war reconciliation effects, civil rights. Now, all these things are explored when I talk to people for me to get a better understanding about the issue. I can go through existing literature to understand what exactly has been happening. And at the same time, I can go ahead and talk to people to understand more about how they make sense of all of these things. So I'm interested in seeing whether some identified problems could have some impact on minority students' capacity to be a leader. So through literature, I have found a lot of problems, but I'm exploring the existence of those problems and also additional issues as well for me to have a better understanding about what the minority student is going through in Sri Lanka. So now when I do this, I cannot omit the fact that I am a minority person as well. Now here's what is interesting. It's a subjective research. Qualitative research is subjective. When it is subjective, if you also belong to the same group, it's very difficult to do this in objective way. Well, of course, if it is subjective, then yes, it is subjective, but subjective research doesn't mean I can be emotional and put my emotions and my ideas, my prejudice, my stereotypes, and my prior knowledge into this research. No, I can't do that. When I study about minority groups, if I have gone through a lot of discrimination, maybe I am slightly more inclined to write about the negative things people may have experienced to show that, yes, there is systematic discrimination. And if I am not a person who's belonging to a minority group, I might do the exact opposite. So here I can't omit the fact that I am a minority as well. So although I try my best to be objective as possible, there is possibility that I have been a victim of the same systemic problems the rest of the minorities have been experiencing. Or maybe I am not. What if, although I am considered minority, I have never felt anything like that and I had a good time in the down south? So is it right for me to say then, yeah, I am Tamil, I have never gone through any problem. I don't think anyone else is going through problems as well. Is it right? Can I say, people in South don't have any problems just because I stayed in South? Do you think any Sri Lankan right now, they don't have any problems? Very recently, someone has commented saying that, a politician has commented saying that, we need independence for the minority groups. And I asked one question. Do you think people in South, Sinhalese people, they have independence? No one has independence. So then, no one has independence. We are dependent by a lot of other external elements. So then, it begs the question, from whom are we seeking this independence? So we are seeking independence because we are dependent on somebody. So then, if I am saying I am minority, I am in South and I am being discriminated, very similarly, my neighbor who is Sinhalese could also say, look, not just you, I have also been discriminated, but not by the same folks, but by a different group of people. So then we are both discriminated in different ways, end of the day. So then maybe I am not so far different from him, or he is not so far different from me. Now that begs the question, how am I going to consider me being minority in my research? So I can't omit it, but I had to be very mindful about all of this because there's a good possibility that my biases will impact my study. So you had to be very mindful about it. You had to keep it aside. We call it the bracketing process. And that's the only way that I'm going to go ahead and explore this research, okay? So there are different qualitative approaches. You have ethnography, and then you have grounded theory, you have interpretative phenomenological analysis, discourse analysis, conversation analysis, content analysis, and narrative analysis. Now today, I will discuss about ethnography, grounded theory, and IPA, interpretative phenomenological analysis. Let's start with IPA. That's the qualitative research type that I know the most. So this is grounded in phenomenology. Now we know phenomenology was a larger philosophy developed by Edmund Husserl. And Husserl's original type of phenomenology, we call it transcendental phenomenology. Okay. Now here the basic idea is that phenomenology is a presupposition-less philosophy. It acknowledges objective laws, but there aren't any presuppositions. So it doesn't have any assumptions per se. So there is no specific rules or regulations for you to start this. You basically try to understand how another person makes sense of what he or she is experiencing, and you are making sense of that as the researcher. And there are no other assumptions in this. Now, in scientific method, we say it has to be testable, refutable, demonstrable. Now, here you don't have this kind of things because it's presuppositionless. And biases, prejudice, stereotypes, etc., must be bracketed prior to research. So if I am minority, my biases about minority groups and the majorities, prejudice, stereotypes, understandings, and stuff like that, I have to keep them aside. I am bracketing them before I do this study. But in uh, existentialism is the extension that has mainly supported interpretative phenomenological analysis. And in one of the books I recently read, where it says that Martin Heidegger has mentioned that you really can't omit yourself and your experiences in a qualitative research. You have to be very mindful about it. But although Edmund Husserl says that you have to bracket it all, it's very difficult to bracket those things. Theoretically, I can see where he's coming from, but then practically, it's very difficult to do. So even the most accurate arguments like cogito ergo sum, which says, I think, therefore I am. So, this is the famous quote of Rene Descartes. It says, I think, therefore I am. If I think I know, I do exist, something like that. Even this kind of statements, they face multiple challenges. They are subjected to, a lot of challenges and all of that as well. And there are videos about why these statements are not 100% accurate, or why it is prone to more criticism and all of that, which you can read later. So although an argument is 100% accurate, or it might look like it is 100% accurate, they still can go through criticisms and challenge. So one could always go behind asking questions. For example, I think, therefore I'm okay. How do you know that you think, and therefore you are? What exactly is the process? So it's like saying, now, for example, think someone says that God has created the world. I ask, okay, who has created the God? And who has created the person who has created the God? Likewise, I can keep on regressing back and back and back. So you are not going to find an answer. That's why we use interpretivism, because we believe, or phenomenologists believe, understanding reality should be based on interpretivism. So interpretivism means interpreting something based on how someone makes sense. So, for example, think like this. If you go through depression, depression has a specific experience, right? It's an experience when you go through depression. So your experience on depression is interpreted to me by you first. You are the patient, so you interpret it to me. Your real experience, you can't say it 100% accurately to me, because you have to narrate it. If you have deficits in your articulation, of course, that will suffer a bit. So you are interpreting what you are going through. And so you are the first one who is making sense of what you are going through. And then I listen to it, and then I start to make sense of what you are going through. So it's a double interpretative process. We call it double hermeneutic process. You make sense, and I make sense of you making sense. So for us to do this very well, we have to take things back to themselves. So if it is racism, try to understand racism for what it is. Don't try to put more and more and more stuff so that you are making it bigger, but try to understand the essence of the problem. So for that, Edmund Husserl said, take things back to themselves. So you can do this by exercise, or by a particular method called imaginative variation and eidetic reduction. So I'm not going to dive deep into those concepts, since this is an introductory level class. But let me show you some basic idea about what imaginative variation is. Let's say I'm a researcher. I want to research about love. Now, what exactly is love exactly? See, I have given multiple types of love. See here, we have an Indian couple, not Indian, white and Indian couple. So they show some affection. So that could be love. Here we have Mitch and Cameron from Modern Family. That is some love. Here we have one of the greatest kings who has ever lived, King Bhumibol Adulyadej of Thailand. And this is him showing affection to his people. That is also a form of love. And at the same time, Prince Nanda in Buddhism and Janapada Kalyani. I have given a hyperlink. If you are going through the presentation, please click on this link and read this. And if you are going through this video, you can just type on Google Prince Nanda and Janapada Kalyani to understand more about what kind of a relationship they shared. And that also is love. In Sinhalese language, there are songs made for this story as well. So what exactly is love then? So these are all different forms of love. So I need to understand the essence of this. What determines that someone loves another? Is it romantic? Is it not romantic? Is it done out of responsibility? Is it done out of accountability? Is it done out of, boundless affection towards people? So a politician may have love towards people as well. A president may have love towards people. A religious head may have love towards his followers, and so on. So this is what you can do now. This is a triangle. Although different, the second one is also a triangle. Although different, even the third one is a triangle, and the fourth one is a triangle, and the fifth is also a triangle. But this has gone through lots of differences, but then again, this sixth one is not a triangle. So we try to understand the variations of the phenomena, and at one point, some of these variations might stop being aligning with the initial phenomena that I am researching. So the moment it stops, I know, okay, this is not the phenomena that I am exploring. What I am exploring is something else. So, for instance, what does it mean to experience Sri Lanka as a minority estate worker? So now this is the question that I'm interested in doing. So I can try to understand about minority estate workers. Minority estate workers are in Galle, like areas like Deniaya, Elpitia, and all of that. And at the same time, in other wet zones, like even in Sabaragamu, like Ratnapura and all of that. And then estate worker doesn't necessarily mean tea estate. There's rubber estates as well. So see, now that's a variation in itself. So I try to understand the problem. My essence here is the estate worker. And the estate worker can stay in different places. So the minority estate worker could be working on a tea estate, on a rubber estate, or any other type of estate. Maybe it's an estate where you don't have any plantation or anything, but could be a holiday home or a factory or anything like that. So you have to change this a little and little for you to understand the core of the issue. So existentialism and IPA, unlike transcendental phenomenology, interpretative phenomenological analysis is a method grounded in existentialism. So Smith, Flowers, and Larkin, they have written a book on 2021. This is really excellent for you to understand more about existentialism and also interpretative phenomenological analysis. So some of the key thinkers of this include Martin Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Gadamer, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Albert Camus. So here the world and being are inseparable. Man is always in a state of becoming, and such investigations of truth should consider subjective experiences, including researchers' preconceived notion of the phenomena of interest. You can't separate the world and the person, the being. Now, the concept of being, of course, is another thing altogether. I'm not going to discuss that here. You can read about Dasein in existentialism to understand more about this concept, like what is exactly meant by being. This is existing, but this is not like really being, right? I am a being. I call myself a being because I this fills the room, but I just don't fill the room. I am existing. So my existence is different from the existence of this, because I'm always in a state of becoming. And at the same time, I have subjective experiences, which you, the researcher, should consider and should analyze, including your own preconceived notions about what you want to investigate or what you want to rather explore. You are exploring about minority relations, so you need to know about my minority relations experiences, and at the same time you have your own experiences as well, which you are using to make more sense of what I am going through, not just myself but a few other minority individuals as well. So in interpretative phenomenology, bracketing exactly is not required. Now some people might say, no, you need to definitely have bracketing. No, you read the book that I just mentioned, Smith, Flowers, and Larkin, and also many other forms of literature on what do you call interpretative phenomenological analysis. It's clearly mentioned that you don't need bracketing. The main component is because it's inseparable. You know, I can't keep myself out of this. It doesn't make sense. So this is very ideographic, which means, you know, we consider a person, one person at a time, and then we do in-depth research about that person. So we explore individual cases here and their experiences in depth. So through this, the researcher generates experiential statements. The method, of course, you know, there's a particular analysis method. So you first do an interview, you gather information. Once you gather this information, what you do is you develop codes. We call them experiential statements. And these experiential statements are put together based on commonality. And then what you do is you develop experiential themes. And then you use these themes to understand the experience of the people. So I would recommend you to go through a specific video on analysis for you to have a better understanding about this. But for the time being, this is something that I just wanted to say so that you would understand basically like what exactly is happening in a qualitative research. I'll try to put a separate video to show you how exactly the qualitative research would work. So IPA is very time consuming. It's extremely time consuming. I have been interviewing people in the last few months, and one interview goes for about an hour, and you have to transcribe it. Now, in some countries, let's say if you are a native English speaker, your accent is really good and all of that. And as a result, you would be able to very easily uh, transcribe it using a software. So they will do the transcribing process. But in our case, it's very difficult because people don't speak in that kind of neutral accent. So what happens is we sometimes have thicker accents and then voice is not picked up very well. And as a result, it's very difficult to use software. So I had to end up typing everything like word to word. So we call it verbatim transcriptions. And these verbatim transcriptions for a 1 hour interview, that would be about 5,000 words. And 5,000 words is a little bit of, you know, it takes so much of time because you had to listen and then you had to type everything. And when you type, you had to observe the person. Was he at distress? Did he hesitate? And stuff like that. So you had to have your record book as well. So you are doing all of this at the same time to have a better understanding about what the person is saying. So you are doing the interview, you are transcribing, and then you had to go through the transcribed document a few times to generate your codes. And then you go ahead and do the same thing for multiple persons. And then finally you come up with your themes. So this takes a lot of time. And at the same time, it all depends upon the experiences you have as a researcher. So you can very closely work with your supervisor on this. And you can use data management softwares like NVivo or Atlas TI if you can afford them. Atlas TI is not that expensive, but what do you call NVivo is very expensive if you need to use. So I do it manually on my Word documents. So it takes time, but then again, the reward is I'm not spending anything extra. So with the rupee depreciation, it's not possible for me to afford such a software, even though I want such software for my work. So you may get 1 to 25 individuals for your research, but as a general rule of thumb, don't try to go for a bigger sample. That is a recipe to self-loathing. Like you start to hate yourself because it's too much. Your supervisor might say go for 20 persons, go for 15 persons and all of that, because they want you to get more information about the research. But in IP, it's very difficult to take that much of people, because you try to understand the cognitive patterns of people. And interpretative phenomenological analysis is greatly used in psychological research, of course. So then if you are a practitioner, if you have better understanding about the cognitive process, these things are all plus points. But then again, since you are going really deep into these issues, since it is ideographic, it's very difficult for you to spend more time thinking about doing these interviews and going through multiple reports, because the documentation is huge. For 7 people, when I did my research, for 7 people, I had verbatim transcribed, reports. That itself was 30,000, and then selecting and copying and pasting it to another document to do my results section. That was 25,000 words, and then you are coding documents and stuff like that. So this is too much of documents just to handle. So that's the thing. I'm not discouraging anyone. It's a lovely process. I like it because I really try to understand the core of the issue. So I am really passionate about my topic. I really do want to understand more about the minute relations. So as a result, it was not too much of a bad deal for me. But then again, you don't need to still go for a larger sample because it's too difficult. And you can collect your data through semi-structured interviews. Semi-structured interviews mean not a structured interview. You have a set of questions. Based on the research questions that you have, you develop an interview guide. What are the questions I need to ask in order to find answers to this research question? So these questions are there, but you don't need to strictly stick to these questions. You may ask additional questions whenever you need as well. So that is what meant by semi-structured interviews. You can do focus groups. Focus group interview means you have multiple people and you do the interview for all of them together, because then you can observe what are the instances where they agree with something, what are the instances where they disagree with something. Disagreements also provide good information, because when you interview a person at a single time, you can't get a bigger understanding about the issue, because he might agree or disagree. But when I have 2-3 people who have experienced the same phenomena, I can get much richer information by observing how they agree and disagree with each other. And then you can go through document reviewing process. You can read existing documents like newspapers, website articles, newsletters, other forms of diaries and stuff like that available about whatever the stuff that you are exploring. You can go through them as well to have a better understanding. Now that is IPA. Very similar to that, you have ethnography. Ethnography is rooted in anthropology and is a descriptive form of research. Here, ethnography means portrait of people, and research usually focuses on describing people and culture. So ethnography is really good to understand people and their culture. So I am not 100% experienced with ethnography. I have learned this some time back, but then this is just me introducing the type of research for you. So people under exploration should have common elements like geographical area, religion, social and familial characteristics, shared experience. So for example, let's say you want to study the Vedda community in Sri Lanka, the indigenous people. So the fact that they are indigenous is a common element. So you can go and do your research. Now here, you try to understand their culture. So probably you might have to stay in the same field for a long time. So here's a good example. Example studies include understanding culture in certain hospital wards to understand typical operations within the ward. So you go to a hospital, you spend some time to understand what kind of surgical procedures they usually do in this particular ward, so that you can develop a mechanism to provide better patient care and to help people, cope up if that is also required after post-surgery recoveries and stuff like that. So this requires, of course, you spending some considerable time inside the hospital. And so that's why I said it requires extensive field where you have to do interviews, you have to observe participants in their natural, setting, and observe non-participants as well. Now, this is also, once again, very time-consuming, and you have to literally immerse yourself in this so that you can, have better understanding. For example, to understand English language learning experiences of Somalian uh, kindergarten to grade 12 students of Minnesota Twin Cities. So you have to go to that particular setting and spend some time to understand this. So the researcher here will try to provide an interpretation of the experiences of the selected population while also acknowledging the difficulties associated with such true portrayal of human experiences. So it's very difficult to portray 100% what a group of people go through. We understand that, but still we try to give some better information about what exactly is happening here. And this becomes very difficult if the researcher has language difficulties. For example, if you don't understand the language of the group that you are researching, if you are not 100% sure about what they're saying, then it becomes extremely difficult as well in the research process. See here, the example says emergency care for obstetrics care for patients in Bangladesh, something like that. So in some sense, ethnography is also phenomenological in its approach because you are trying to understand the experience. So next one is grounded theory. Here, the methodology for grounded theory is originated with the work of Glaser and Strauss on the interaction between healthcare professionals and dying patients. Now, grounded theory is all about generating a specific theory. So using specific strategies, you collect data and you will develop a newer theory. Now, grounded theory is also, once again, phenomenological. This means it attempts to understand how participants make sense of their experiences and does not assume that participants' accounts refer to some verifiable reality. The experiences that you gather from people is required to see how they make sense of things around them, but it doesn't necessarily connote with a specific reality. It might exist or not, but we are just trying to make sense. However, grounded theory goes beyond phenomenology because whatever the explanations that you get out of this, you use it to develop a new theory. Okay, now in phenomenology, I'm not going to make a theory out of it. I explore to understand how they make sense. But here you get this information and then you create a new theory. Now, the theory of grief process is a good example for grounded theory. Grief is a phenomenon. It's something the researchers formally acknowledge in research. We know there is a concept called grief. You lose someone, you go through a process of grieving. All of us know this, right? We know this. However, through such acknowledgement of usual grieving process, healthcare professionals and mental health practitioners could help people make terms with the losses. Now, if I lose someone, I am grieving. I know what grieving is all about. You know what grieving is all about. But I want someone to help me sometimes to make terms with the fact that I have lost someone. And if you understand the process of grieving by interviewing people and by making sense of how they grieve, then you can help me to, make terms with the loss that I have in my life. You will know what I mean by this if you have ever lost someone that is close to you. It's very difficult. It's a difficult process. It's a very difficult process. I'm not saying it's an easier process. It's very difficult. So then if someone is there to guide you, then that's something that we would know. Why do we need to know about this? Because some people go through abnormal reactions. Not everyone is equally graduating from the grief cycle. Some people, they don't recover the way that we expect them to recover. There's a condition called complicated grief where they don't recover even after 6 months. They continue to have the same thing. They might go through other conditions which might require further diagnosis and testing and all of that. So then the only way that you know that they are going through something that is not normal is only if you know about the usual process that a person goes through when they lose someone. You need to know grieving to know the abnormal methods of grieving. Simple as that. So this is the grief cycle. So I have just given here, I just took this from Google. You will be in denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So this is the cycle, but some people might not go through this cycle the same way. So since you know about this is how usually people go through it. If someone is not going through, then you would know. So data collection methods for this include interviews, observations, literature reviews, document reviews, and things like that. Okay. So conclusion. So there's quite a lot more to teach in qualitative research, to be very honest. But this is a beginner level course, so I don't want to overburden you with qualitative research, but we'll be doing one more week of qualitative research as well. My main intention here is to give you a better understanding about qualitative research, which I hope now you have some understanding. But if this is the first time that you are going through qualitative research, this could be a little bit overwhelming as well, because we went through multiple concepts and most of these things are pretty related to philosophy. So I would encourage you to spend more time reading about philosophy, trying to understand more about these concepts that we have been discussing, and to read more about phenomenological research, grounded theory, and stuff like that. You can search plenty of these things on YouTube. Maybe you will find much more simplified explanations of these concepts than the ones that I have been doing right now, because that is just my personal experience of these things, and I'm trying to simplify it. But then again, I start to think about a lot of other things as well, which then sometimes complicates the entire thing. So sometimes you might find much more simplified answers, but I always believe that I need to tell the full story to my students. Without telling the full story, I don't think it might give you any leverage in terms of making sense. So we were talking about making sense, so then I might as well help you to make sense by giving a good chunk of information. So that is one of those things that I wanted to do in this lecture. So I think I took more time compared to the previous ones today, but that's okay. I just wanted to make sure that this is addressed well. So if you have any questions, please let me know. So that's it for today. So thank you very much and have a very good week ahead. So I'll see you again. Thank you very much.